Time out or time up for the Prime Minister?
Well, good to see you too, Alistair. Listen, clearly it's been a tricky couple of weeks. The Prime Minister was very clear, not this week, the previous week, where he apologised for what happened in Downing Street, said that with the benefit of hindsight, he wishes he'd ordered everybody inside, and asked, I think not unreasonably, for space for Sue Gray to complete her report, to come forward with the facts around what happened and the context within which they happened. And then he has rightly and properly undertaken that he will come back to the House of Commons, make a statement and answer questions to MPs on that. But I think what you saw this week at Prime Minister's Question Time is that Boris is relishing the opportunity to implement the manifesto for which he got that incredibly personal mandate in 2019. He announced the end of pretty much all the pandemic restrictions. COVID is, in a sense, in the rearview mirror now, and we've got to get back to the priorities of delivering for the British people.
Absolutely. But one thing that strikes me about all of this is that many people, I mean, on my Twitter feed, but also in conversation, say the thing you've got to understand about Boris Johnson is he's a wrong 'un, but he's our wrong 'un. In the current climate, Connor, that's not good enough.
Well, look, I supported the Prime Minister. I was his parliamentary private secretary when he was Foreign Secretary. I left Theresa May's government on the same day that he did, and I was at his side during the leadership. And I believed, and I believe, that Boris is the right person to lead our country at this particular time in our national story. And it shouldn't therefore surprise you to know that the Prime Minister retains my full support. One of the wisest things David Cameron once said was, Twitter is not the British people. And I've been down here in my own constituency in Bournemouth over the last couple of days. I was doing constituency visits yesterday. And there was a plethora of things that people wanted to talk to me about. And they were across the range of things that government needs to do to deliver to make the lives of the people of this country better, to make our country as a whole more prosperous, more secure and stronger in the wider world. And I still believe that Boris is the man to lead us through this time.
If heads have to roll, these are men and women that he appointed. If the Metropolitan Police are going to sit down and talk to Rag about whipping having gone wrong, that's on his watch as well. At some point, he's going to have to do more than just, look, I'm very, very sorry. He's going to have to take some responsibility as well.
Well, look, Will Ragg made some pretty incendiary and outrageous and very serious allegations. It is no secret that the government whips of all governments over decades have sought to persuade members of Parliament who have concerns to back the government's legislative agenda. That's in the nature of how Parliament works. But I can tell you, Alistair, based on my experience of 12 years now as a Member of Parliament, serving as a PPS in, I think, 5 different government departments, having pitched and persuaded and campaigned for resources to come to my own constituency for new schools, for coastal community funding to improve the peer approach area of my Bournemouth West constituency, that the processes that you go through to get these funds allocated to you are absolutely rigorous. They are applied impartially. Civil servants oversee them. So the idea for a second that the whips or anybody else in government would have the power or the ability to withhold funding from an individual's constituency when they made a legitimate case for need is just simply wrong.
So do you simply disbelieve the suggestion then from Christian Wakeford that he was told, back off and you'll get a school, don't back off, rebel, and you won't get a school? Is that simply not true?
Well, I believe the words of both my predecessor and my successor as International Trade Minister, who read out on one of your competitor news outlets the other day, the tweet exchanges between him and Christian Wakeford over the trade bill. And it was very clear there was no conditionality. There was no mention of school funding. So, no, I do not, I'm afraid, accept the assertions that have been made in that quarter.
Final question. Lord Adonis said it, but didn't get quite as much traction. When Michael Heseltine, Lord Heseltine, says it, it's got huge traction. Have they let the cat out of the bag? If Boris goes, Brexit goes?
I think I retweeted or commented on Lord Adonis's tweet saying, you know, here's the real agenda. There are a lot of people in this country, Boris's political opponents, particularly on the European issue, who have never forgiven him as the sort of the liberal mayor of London figure who went out there and put himself at the head of the Leave campaign and in a sense gave decent people, honourable people, liberal people, internationalist people, globalist people, the right, the permission, the cover to vote for an independent United Kingdom by voting to leave the European Union. And I think you're seeing, to some degree, it's not totally that, but to some degree, that constant fury at what Boris did over the Leave campaign, for which I personally and millions of others are deeply in his debt.
Conor Burns, always good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for your time this Saturday afternoon. Take care. Keep in touch.
Good to see you.
That was Conor Burns there, one of the Prime Minister's leading supporters and Minister of State for Northern Ireland. Joining me now for his take is Henry Hill, who's the news editor of Conservative Home, widely known by friends and foe alike as being one of the authoritative voices of what's really going on in the Conservative Party. Henry, great to see you. Time out or time up for the Prime Minister?
Oh, I mean, it's time up. Absolutely. It's a sense of when the rebels haven't managed to get their act together yet. I think it could potentially be a slow, drawn-out process, but it's almost impossible to see how Boris Johnson salvages his premiership at this point. I think the important thing to remember always is that whilst the individual cut and thrust, the up and down of each day is super engaging and, keeps people like us who comment us about politics for a living engaged and amused, all these things always boil down to the fundamentals. Why did Tory MPs make Boris Johnson Prime Minister? Because he was a winner, because he had an ability to connect with voters who don't normally vote Conservative. Does he now look like a winner? No. His polling is personally terrible. He's a drag on the Conservative vote. And most importantly, in those red wall areas, those areas of the country that lent the Tories their vote in 2019 on account of the Prime Minister, we're now hearing from activists on the doorstep, local councillors, people campaigning for council by-elections and getting ready for the local elections, that it's having a devastating impact on the Conservative Party position in precisely those areas that he won. So no, I think all of that's going to be fed back to MPs, and sooner rather than later, hopefully, he will be on the way out.
You make an interesting distinction there in your analysis between people like us who talk about it, according to my Twitter feed, too much, people on the doorstep, party workers, and the ordinary Joe and Joanna public, as it were. And how damaging, in your view, is, forget how people are going to vote at the next election, because that's a moving feast, but that getting on for 80% of folk, as polled, say they've lost trust in him?
I mean, it's critically important, especially, we're very lucky, hopefully, that the country has properly turned a corner on COVID-19 now, and we're heading out of the era of restrictions. But remember the position of enormous trust that the government has demanded of us over the last 2 years, when it's put itself in this position to impose such extraordinary restrictions on our personal freedoms and liberties. That demand, trust in government, is the essential condition for making that work. So fundamentally, we're in a position where if God help us, the pandemic took a turn for the worse, it isn't obvious anymore that the Prime Minister has the moral authority to actually impose any measures on the nation, but also just in general. From the Conservative Party's perspective and the nation's perspective, this constant distrust is corrosive. It's corrosive of actually our entire democratic process. If people are constantly cynical, if they do believe politicians are all the same and are in it for themselves. And I think one of the most tragic things about this is that actually Boris Johnson, I've never been his biggest fan, but I absolutely credit him with the 2019 general election. And the reason that he pulled that off is because he did genuinely have this ability to make people who felt they weren't being listened to by politicians, whether this was in the EU referendum or afterwards, they felt they had a connection. They felt, and he brought them into the political process. And I thought that was an incredibly good thing. And actually, I want to try and salvage that, because one of the worst outcomes of this would be if all those people who gave politics a chance because of Boris Johnson decided, because of Boris Johnson, that it had played them for fools.
Final point then, in that context, and focused very much on ordinary people, voters. They read in the newspapers, and they may get it over the next few days, more lifting of Plan B type restrictions on COVID, a return of freedoms, go out there and do your own thing. Plus, come April, you might just not face an increase in national insurance, and you might not be paying a little bit more tax. They're going to put a lot of what you've said behind them and think, I'll have some of that.
I mean, they might, and that will certainly be the Prime Minister's hope. But last weekend, I was actually up in part of the Red Wall, and I was talking to councillors who owed their positions to the political revolution that Boris Johnson had driven. I was up in Rotherham, where the Conservatives went from 0 to 20 councillors in one election because of that amazing redrawing of the political map that Boris Johnson personally pulled off. And it's not really my view that I'm giving you so much as like the feedback they were getting from their voters on the doorstep. So I do think this is actually cut through.